Episode 1, The Unfolding Mystery of Betrayal. Looking back, my life with Susie seemed picture perfect. We had been married for 7 years, with 2 beautiful boys, aged 4 and 6. Our routines were comfortable. Almost idyllic mornings spent rushing out the door, sharing school drop-offs and pickups, family dinners, and quiet evenings together. I had a stable job in upper management at a tech company, and Susie worked in accounting. It was the kind of life I'd dreamed of, but as I've come to realize, even the best dreams can hide a nightmare. The first cracks appeared so subtly that I almost didn't notice. Susie began coming home later than usual, her cheerful smile intact but her stories about work and colleagues more vague than they used to be. Just a busy day at the office, she'd say when I asked. At first, I didn't press her. Why would I? She was my wife, my partner. Trust was the foundation of everything we'd built together, or so I thought. Then, one night, something felt off. She came home well after the boys had gone to bed. I'd stayed up, waiting, pretending to watch TV while my mind raced. When the door finally opened, she greeted me with a casual, "Hey, sorry I'm late. Dinner with the girls ran long." I nodded, but something about her demeanor felt different, almost detached. She headed straight to the bathroom, mentioning something about cigarette smoke. I brushed it off at first, but as these late nights became more frequent, my curiosity started to grow into something darker, suspicion. It wasn't just the late nights. Susie had always been open about her phone, leaving it on the counter or couch without a second thought. But now, her phone was almost surgically attached to her hand. When I happened to glance at it, I noticed something odd. Her message history was completely wiped, except for a few generic texts from me and some family members. I couldn't make sense of it. Why would someone delete their entire conversation history unless they had something to hide? One night, we attended a barbecue at Anne and Paul's house, and was Susie's new best friend, a relationship that had seemingly sprung out of nowhere. Paul and I weren't particularly close, but we got along well enough. That evening, as the kids watched a movie inside, Paul and I sat on the deck with beers in hand. Paul was already tipsy, his speech slightly slurred, his posture more relaxed than usual. "You're a good guy, Jack," he said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. "Thanks," I replied, taken aback. "What brought you talk that on?" He chuckled darkly, swirling the beer in his glass. "Because I don't know how you do it. I mean, all those late nights, I couldn't handle it." I stiffened. "What are you talking about?" Paul leaned closer, his eyes glassy but serious. "Susie, do you believe those girls' night stories? And used to pull the same crap on me. Trust me, Jack, there's always more to it." A lump formed in my throat, but I forced a laugh. "Come on, Paul, you've had too much to drink." "Maybe," he said, his tone laced with bitterness, "but you know I'm right. I didn't sleep that night." Susie, oblivious, went to bed early. I stayed up, staring at the ceiling, replaying Paul's words over and over. Was he just projecting his insecurities onto me? Or was there some truth in what he'd said? The thought knotted me like a splinter I couldn't remove. The next day, I began to watch Susie more closely. Her morning routine was the same: kiss the boys goodbye, grab her coffee, and head to work with a bright smile. But her evenings, those were different. She started coming home later and later, sometimes well past midnight. We got caught up talking. She'd explain casually, but the faint smell of cigarette smoke clung to her hair, and she always made a beeline for the shower as soon as she walked in. It felt calculated, as if she were washing away more than just the smell. On Wednesday night, my suspicions reached a boiling point. Susie had texted earlier, saying she'd be out late. After putting the boys to bed, I sat in my office, staring at the clock. Midnight came and went. By 12:15 a.m., I heard the familiar sound of her key in the lock. She stepped inside, startled to see me sitting in the living room. "Jack, you scared me," she said, clutching her chest. "What are you doing up?" "Waiting for you," I replied evenly. "Long night?" She hesitated, her eyes flicking toward the stairs. "Yeah, Anne and I were just talking. We were talking about a big project at work." "Until after midnight?" I asked, my voice calm but firm. Her face hardened, a flicker of defiance in her eyes. "What are you implying?" I stood, my heart pounding. "I'm not implying anything. I'm asking you a question." For a moment, she said nothing. Her smile softened into something almost playful, which took me by surprise. "Jack, you're thinking too much," she said, her voice calmer now. "I didn't mean to worry you," she admitted. a hint of sincerity creeping into her voice. "I didn't mean to worry you, I just lost track of time." I sighed, ran a hand through my hair, and nodded, but as I watched her ascend the stairs, I couldn't help but feel a weight of unease on my chest. The morning, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee in hand. The aroma filled the room, but I couldn't bring myself to drink it. Susie hummed softly as she prepared lunches for the boys, her movements light and unbothered, as though the previous night hadn't happened. She acted as if everything was perfectly normal, as if she hadn't just shattered my trust with her cold, calculating words. "Dad, can we have pancakes tomorrow?" my eldest son asked, tugging on my sleeve and pulling me out of my thoughts. "Of course, buddy," I said, ruffling his hair. My voice sounded steady, but inside, I was anything but. I glanced at Susie, hoping for some sign of remorse or acknowledgement of our strained reality. Instead, she was smiling at our youngest, her face radiant, serene like a stranger. I wanted to confront her, to shout, to demand answers, but what would be the point? But I have no proof. That day, I decided to act not out of anger, but necessity. Susie wasn't just my wife anymore, she was an opponent, and I needed to understand her moves before I made my own. I started small. While she was busy with the boys that evening, I retreated to my office and began searching for patterns. The first step was our phone bill. I logged into the account and scrolled through the list of calls and texts. Most of them were innocent enough, messages to me, her family, and a few colleagues, but one number stood out. It wasn't saved as a contact, but it appeared regularly, often during her supposed girls' nights. My stomach twisted as I jotted it down. Who was this person, and what role did they play in all of this? The next challenge was tracking her whereabouts. Susie was careful. Her phone was locked, and she rarely left her laptop unattended. But her car? That was a different story. The idea hit me while I was researching GPS trackers online, a discreet device that could show me exactly where she went. I purchased one immediately, and when it arrived the next day, I installed it under her car's bumper while she was inside putting the boys to bed. On Wednesday evening, Susie texted me to say she'd be out late. "Don't wait up," she wrote, adding a heart emoji at the end. The audacity of it made my blood boil. I tucked the boys in, kissed them goodnight, and sat in my office, watching the GPS app on my phone. The small blinking dot representing her car moved steadily toward the city center, finally stopping at an upscale restaurant. Curiosity and dread battled within me as I stared at the screen. Was this just a harmless dinner with Anne, or was there more to it? Grabbing my keys, I decided to see for myself. The restaurant was bustling when I arrived. From the parking lot, I scanned the large windows, hoping for a glimpse of her. It didn't take long. There she was, seated near the back, dressed in a way I hadn't seen in months, elegant, confident, radiant, and across from her sat a man I didn't recognize. He was tall, sharply dressed, and entirely too comfortable in her presence. They were laughing, leaning toward each other, their faces glowing with an intimacy that was unmistakable. My chest tightened, anger and heartbreak colliding within me. I snapped a few photos with my phone, my hands trembling. What was I supposed to do? Storm in and create a scene? Confront her and demand answers? No, that would only give her more ammunition against me. For now, I needed to stay calm and gather as much evidence as I could. I stayed parked outside the restaurant, watching as the evening unfolded. It was nearly midnight when they emerged, their laughter spilling into the quiet night. Susie's hand rested lightly on his arm, her head tilted back as she smiled at something he'd said. My breath caught in my throat as I saw her kiss him, not a quick peck, but a lingering, deliberate kiss that made my stomach churn. They stood by her car for a few more minutes, talking softly, before finally parting ways. She got into her car and drove off, her expression content, almost blissful. I waited until she was out of sight before starting my own car, following her at a distance. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as I watched her turn into our neighborhood and pull into the driveway. When she got home, she parked and walked inside home. I waited until the lights in our bedroom flicked on before heading home. The next morning, she was back to her usual self, bright, cheerful, and completely unbothered. She greeted me with a kiss on the cheek, packed the boys' lunches, and headed off to work like nothing had happened. I couldn't wrap my head around it. How could she lie so effortlessly? How could she betray everything we'd built and then look me in the eye as if I was the one in the wrong? That day at work, I couldn't focus. My mind kept replaying the events of the previous night, the laughter, the kiss, the way she looked at him. Who was this man? How long had this been going on? And, more importantly, what was I going to do about it? By the time I got home, I had a plan. I needed more evidence, enough to confront her in a way she couldn't deny, enough to protect myself if things escalated. Over the next few days, I started piecing together the puzzle. Using the photos I'd taken, I began searching online, trying to identify the man she'd been with. I also monitored her car's movements through the GPS tracker, logging every location she visited. One night, while she was in the shower, I managed to unlock her phone using a fingerprint she'd accidentally left on the screen. What I found confirmed my worst fears. Her messaging app contained hidden chats, filled with flirty exchanges and plans to meet. The messages were with the same number that appeared on our phone bill, the same man I'd seen her with at the restaurant. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. This wasn't just suspicion anymore, this was proof. The proof on Susie's phone made my heart ache, a confirmation of the betrayal I had been fearing. Her messages to this man, who I now knew as Eric, were damning. They weren't just flirtatious, they were explicit, filled with plans and promises that made my stomach churn. They talked about their dates, their stolen moments, and even joked about how easily I was being deceived. He doesn't have a clue. One of her messages read, followed by a laughing emoji. Another message, sent after one of her late nights out, chilled me to the core. You make me feel alive in a way I haven't felt in years. Thank you for showing me what I've been missing. What had I done to deserve this? Was I not enough? These questions swirled in my mind, but I quickly pushed them aside. This wasn't about my shortcomings, it was about her choices. And now, I had enough evidence to act. I spent the next few days gathering every piece of information I could. The GPS tracker revealed a pattern: regular visits to restaurants, hotels, and, once, even a park in the middle of the day. I compiled all the data, meticulously logging dates, times, and locations. I knew I couldn't afford any mistakes. If I confronted her without a solid plan, she'd twist the narrative, using the legal system to her advantage. But as much as I hated what she'd done, I couldn't help but feel conflicted. We had 2 boys who adored their mother. Did I want to hurt them world by exposing her deceit? The answer came to me late one night as I stared at a photo of the 4 of us, taken on a family vacation 2 years ago. We looked so happy, so whole, but it was all a lie now, and lies have consequences. On Saturday morning, Susie told me she'd be going out that evening for a baby shower with Anne. She said it casually, her tone light, almost dismissive. I forced a smile, nodding as if I believed her. Inside, though, I was seething. I knew there was no baby shower, there was only Eric. Have fun, I said, kissing her on the cheek as she walked out the door. The moment she left, I checked the GPS app. Her car was heading downtown again, this time to a boutique hotel. My chest tightened as I watched the dot on the screen stop moving. She was there, with him. I thought about driving there, storming into the lobby, and confronting her on the spot. But what would that accomplish? A scene? A temporary satisfaction? No, I needed to think bigger. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about reclaiming control. When she came home that night, it was well past midnight. I heard her keys jingling in the lock, followed by the soft thud of her heels on the hardwood floor. She smelled faintly of perfume and alcohol. Her cheeks flushed. Did you have a good time? I asked from the living room, my tone neutral. She froze for a moment, then turned to face me. It was fine, she said, her voice steady. Just the usual baby shower stuff. I nodded, letting the silence stretch between us. Her eyes darted to the stairs, and I could see the tension in her shoulders. She was hiding something, and she knew I could sense it. Well, I'm heading to bed, she said, forcing a yawn. Good night. Good night, I replied, watching her retreat up the stairs. Once she was out of sight, I exhaled, my hands trembling. Confrontation could wait. Tonight wasn't the night. The following day, I began putting my plan into action. First, I reached out to a lawyer I trusted, someone discreet who could guide me through the legal labyrinth I was about to enter. We discussed my findings, the GPS logs, the messages, the photos, and he assured me that I had a strong case. However, the house, car, and everything else are all in her name. The lawyer warned me about the risks. In this state, she'll still have leverage, he said. You need to be strategic if you want to come out on top. Strategic, that word stuck with me. I couldn't let emotions dictate my next steps. If I wanted to protect myself and my boys, I needed to outthink her. The next part of my plan involved subtle changes around the house. I began securing my financial assets, redirecting funds to a separate account that only I had access to. I also started documenting everything: her late nights, her absences, her excuses. Each entry was dated and detailed, building a timeline of her behavior that I could use if things escalated. But I didn't stop there. I knew Susie's trust in me was waning, and she'd likely become more cautious if she suspected anything. So, I complimented her more often, asked about her work outings, and even suggested we plan a family vacation. She seemed caught off guard by my sudden enthusiasm but didn't question it. One evening, as she was getting ready for another girls' night, I sat on the edge of the bed, watching her. She was radiant, her makeup flawless, her dress hugging her figure in a way that made my chest ache. How could someone so beautiful be so deceptive? "Do you think we're doing okay?" I asked suddenly, breaking the silence. She paused, her hands hovering over her earrings. "What do you mean?" "You know, us. I just feel like we've been a little distant lately." Her expression softened, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of the woman I'd fallen in love with. "Jack, we're fine," she said, walking over and placing a hand on my shoulder. "Every couple goes through phases. This is just a busy time for both of us." I nodded, forcing a smile. "I guess you're right." "Of course I'm right," she said with a laugh, kissing my forehead. "Now, don't wait up for me, okay?" As I watched her leave, my resolve hardened. This wasn't just about her infidelity anymore. It was about preserving what mattered most: my family, my dignity, my future. Episode 2: The Truth That Hurts Deep. The decision to dig deeper into Susie's double life wasn't born from anger, but necessity. I realized that without concrete proof, I couldn't protect myself or my children. I had spent years trusting her, believing in the life we'd built together, only to discover that it had all been a mirage. Now, it was time to face the truth, no matter how much it hurt. The realization of Susie's betrayal was no longer just a gut feeling, it was a fact, a cold, undeniable truth. But the more I uncovered, the more I realized I didn't know the full scope of her deceit. This wasn't just about her infidelity. There were other layers at play, and I needed to peel them back one by one. In the days following my discovery of her messages and movements, I began noticing patterns I had previously overlooked. Susie wasn't just reckless, she was deliberate, almost rehearsed. Every action, every excuse, felt calculated. But what struck me most was her confidence, the way she carried on as though nothing was wrong, as though I would never find out. One evening, she announced she was going out again. "Anne and I are grabbing dinner," she said casually, slipping on her shoes. "We'll probably be late." "Take your time," I replied, my voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. As soon as she left, I opened the GPS app on my phone. Her car was already heading toward the city, the familiar blinking dot stopping at yet another upscale restaurant. But this time, I didn't follow her. I already knew what I would find. Instead, I began focusing on the people around her, specifically Anne. Anne had always been Susie's closest friend, but their friendship had deepened over the past year. It was Anne who suggested these girls' nights, and who always seemed to be conveniently present whenever Susie needed an alibi. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that Anne might know far more than she let on. I decided to test the waters at our next interaction. Anne and her husband Paul had invited us over for dinner, a rare occasion considering how distant things had felt lately. I accepted without hesitation, knowing this could be my chance to observe her more closely. The evening began uneventfully. The kids played in the living room while the adults gathered on the patio. Paul poured drinks, his movements slow and deliberate, while Anne and Susie dominated the conversation. Their laughter grated on my nerves, but I forced myself to stay composed. I began, keeping my tone light. "You and Susie have been spending a lot of time together lately, keeping her out of trouble?" Anne smirked, exchanging a quick glance with Susie. "Always," she replied. "You know how it is, just girls letting off steam." "Of course," I said, nodding. "It's good to have someone you can trust." Anne's smile faltered for the briefest moment, and I caught a flicker of something in her eyes: hesitation, maybe even guilt. But she quickly recovered, her tone smooth and practiced. "Susie's lucky to have a who mentality husband. Not all men are so understanding." Susie chuckled, reaching for her drink. "Jack's always been the laid-back type," she said, her voice laced with an almost mocking affection. The conversation moved on, but the tension lingered beneath the surface. I couldn't shake the feeling that Anne was hiding something, though I didn't have enough to confront her. Not yet. Later that evening, Paul and I found ourselves alone on the patio. The women were inside preparing dessert, their voices muffled by the sliding glass door. Paul looked tired, his shoulders slumped as he sipped his drink. I hesitated before speaking, unsure of how much I could trust him. "Paul," I began, my voice low, "can I ask you something?" He glanced at me, his expression wary. "Sure. It's about Anne and Susie," I said carefully. "Do you ever feel like they're keeping secrets?" Paul snorted. Secrets? That woman couldn't keep her mouth shut if her life depended on it." His bitterness surprised me. "So you don't think she's involved in anything?" Paul frowned, setting his drink down. "Look, Jack, I don't know what's going on between you and Susie, but if Anne's involved, it's only because she loves the drama. She thrives on it." His words confirmed what I'd suspected. Anne wasn't just a passive bystander, she was an instigator. The realization made my stomach churn, but it also gave me a new target. If Anne was feeding into Susie's behavior, I needed to find a way to use that against them. The next day, I texted Anne, posing as a concerned husband. "Hey, I know you're close to Susie, and I appreciate that. I just feel like she's been a little distant lately. Is everything okay?" Her response came quickly. "Oh, Jack, you're overthinking it. She's just stressed with work and the kids. Don't worry, she loves you." It was exactly what I expected her to say, and was covering for Susie, just as I'd suspected. But now that I knew where her loyalties lay, I could start planning my next move. Over the next few days, I paid closer attention to the dynamics between Susie and Anne. Every phone call, every text exchange, every moment they spent together was another piece of the puzzle. I noticed how Anne always seemed to be the one suggesting plans, how she laughed a little too loudly at Susie's jokes, and how she glanced my way with an expression that bordered on smug. She thought she was untouchable, just like Susie. One evening, as Susie prepared to leave for another girls' night, I decided to test Anne's resolve further. "Say hi to Anne for me," I said casually as Susie grabbed her purse. She paused for a fraction of a second before flashing me a smile. "Will do." The hesitation was brief, but it was enough to confirm my suspicions. Anne wasn't just an accomplice, she was an active participant in Susie's lies. But the truth was, they were both playing a dangerous game, and I was ready to change the rules. As Susie walked out the door, I pulled out my phone and opened the GPS app. Her car was heading toward the city again, the same pattern repeating itself. But instead of focusing on her movements, I turned my attention to Anne. If Paul was right about her love for drama, she'd eventually slip up. All I had to do was wait, and when she did, I'd be ready. As Susie left the house that evening, her demeanor calm and confident, I stayed behind, not to follow her this time, but to focus on unraveling the deeper truth. Following her physically had provided some insight, but I needed more, something concrete that tied the threads of her actions together. Her closest confidant, had begun to emerge as a significant piece of the puzzle. Her overly rehearsed responses and deflections were starting to wear thin. It wasn't just that Anne knew what was going on. She seemed to be actively enabling Susie's betrayal. If I wanted to protect myself and the boys, I needed to expose not only Susie but also the network of deceit that supported her. The next morning, I decided to approach Anne in a more direct way. I needed to see how much she was willing to admit and, more importantly, how much she would try to protect Susie. Instead of texting or calling, I decided to visit Anne at her house. The unannounced nature of my visit would give me an edge. She wouldn't have time to prepare her responses. When she opened the door, her surprise was evident. "Jack, what a surprise. Is everything okay?" "I just wanted to talk," I said, offering a polite smile. "Do you have a moment?" Anne hesitated, but eventually stepped aside to let me in. Her living room was pristine, as always, but there was an underlying tension in the air. She gestured for me to sit, then joined me on the couch, her expression carefully neutral. "What's on your mind?" she asked, her voice steady but guarded. I leaned forward, clasping my hands together. I need your help. Susie's been distant lately, and I can't shake the feeling that something's wrong." "You're her best friend, I figured you'd have some insight." Anne's eyes flickered, her confidence faltering for a split second before she recovered. "Jack, I don't think it's my place to speak for Susie. She's been under a lot of stress, but I'm sure it's nothing you need to worry about." Her response was expected but still frustrating. "Stress," I repeated, nodding slowly. "You're probably right, but it's hard not to notice how often she's out these days. Late nights, weekend plans. I just want to make sure everything's okay. And shifted in her seat, clearly uncomfortable. Jack, I think you're overthinking things. Susie loves you, she just needs some space to breathe. It was the same line she'd used in her texts, but hearing it in person felt even more hollow, and wasn't going to crack easily. But her hesitation spoke volumes. She wasn't just protecting Susie, she was protecting herself. When I left Anne's house, I felt a mix of frustration and resolve. Her evasive answers had confirmed what I already suspected: she was deeply involved, whether as an accomplice or simply as someone who thrived on the drama. But if I wanted to use that against her, I needed to catch her off guard, to force her into a situation where she couldn't rely on rehearsed lines. That evening, I started digging deeper into Anne's digital presence. Social media can be a treasure trove of unintentional confessions, and Anne's posts were no exception. Her timeline was filled with photos of casual outings, cryptic captions, and comments that seemed innocuous at first glance. But one post caught my attention: a photo from a recent girls' night, tagged with locations that didn't match the timeline Susie had given me. The caption read, "Sometimes, the best nights are the ones you can't talk about." The accompanying comments were equally telling, with Susie chiming in, "You always know how to make things exciting." My stomach churned as I read through the thread. These weren't just casual outings, they were covert missions, deliberately obscured from anyone who might ask too many questions. And wasn't just complicit, she was enjoying this. I decided to keep my distance from Anne for a few days, giving her a false sense of security. Meanwhile, I focused on observing Susie's interactions with her. Their phone calls, text exchanges, and sudden plans revealed a dynamic I hadn't fully understood before. And wasn't just covering for Susie, she was enabling her to act without fear of consequence. It was a partnership built on secrecy, and I needed to exploit that. One evening, as Susie was getting ready to leave for another girls' night, I made a calculated move. "Say hi to Anne for me," I said casually as she slipped on her shoes. She paused briefly, her hand hovering over the doorknob. "Will do," she replied, her tone light but with an edge of hesitation. I watched her leave, my mind racing with possibilities. That hesitation wasn't just a response to my comment, it was a crack in her armor. Susie was beginning to sense that I wasn't as oblivious as she thought, and that meant Anne would be next. 2 days later, I called Anne under the guise of seeking advice. Can we meet for coffee?" I asked, keeping my tone light. "I've been feeling a bit lost lately, and I could really use your perspective." Her response was immediate. "Of course, Jack, when and where?" We arranged to meet at a quiet cafe downtown, a neutral setting where I could control the conversation. When she arrived, she looked composed, but there was a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. She wanted to know what I knew, and that gave me the upper hand. We exchanged pleasantries before I steered the conversation toward Susie. "I appreciate everything you've done for Susie over the years," I began. "You've been such a great friend to her, but I can't help feeling like there's something she's not telling me." Anne's smile wavered, and she took a sip of her coffee to buy time. "Jack, I don't think it's my place to get involved in your marriage. Susie loves you, she's just been under a lot of pressure." Her response was predictable, but I pressed on. "Pressure from what? Work? The kids? Or something else?" Anne hesitated, her hands tightening around her cup. "Jack, I really think you're overthinking this. Susie's just figuring things out. We all go through phases." As I left the cafe, I felt a renewed sense of determination. Anne might not have given me the answers I wanted, but her reluctance to speak openly told me everything I needed to know. She was hiding something, and it was only a matter of time before I exposed it. The game was shifting, and I was no longer just a passive player. Susie and Anne had built their web of lies carefully, but every web has a breaking point, and I was getting closer to finding it. After my conversation with Anne, I returned home feeling a mix of frustration and resolve. She hadn't given me the full truth, but her hesitations and deflections had confirmed that she was involved in some way. Whether she was actively enabling Susie's betrayal or simply covering for her out of loyalty, it didn't matter. I don't think I can get any information out of her, but I have evidence, so I'll decide to confront Susie directly. The tension in the house was suffocating. Every glance, every word exchanged between Susie and me carried an undercurrent of hostility. The nights were the worst, silent, heavy, filled with unspoken accusations. I knew I couldn't keep living like this. The confrontation was inevitable, and it needed to happen before the weight of her betrayal crushed me completely. That night, after dinner, I sent the boys to bed early. I sat in the living room, nursing a glass of whiskey as I waited for Susie. She appeared in the doorway, looking surprised to see me sitting there in the dim light. "You're up late," she said, her tone neutral but wary. "Is something wrong?" I gestured to the armchair across from me. "Sit down, Susie, we need to talk." Her brows furrowed, but she complied, settling into the chair with an air of annoyance. "All right," she said, crossing her legs. "What's this about?" I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. "Do you have anything to hide from me?" I said, watching her face closely. Her reaction was subtle but telling, a flicker of recognition in her eyes, quickly replaced by a mask of indifference. She sighed, shaking her head. "I don't." I was annoyed to hear those words. I said with a more serious face, "Eric, you know the name. I already know everything." Then I put the pile of evidence and documents on the table. "So, you finally figured it out," she said, her tone cool. The nonchalance in her voice ignited something inside me. "How long, Susie?" I demanded, my voice rising. "How long have you been lying to me, to our family?" She shrugged, unbothered. "Does it matter? You already know. What difference does it make?" I clenched my fists, trying to keep my composure. "The difference," I said through gritted teeth, "is that I trusted you. I built my life around you, and you threw it all away." Her eyes narrowed, her expression hardening. "Don't act like you're blameless, Jack. Do you think you're the perfect husband? You've been so busy with work, so distant, that you didn't even notice how miserable I was." Her deflection stung, but I refused to let her shift the blame. "So your solution was to cheat? To betray me and our boys? You didn't even try to fix things." She leaned forward, her voice sharp. "Fix things? Do you think this marriage can be fixed? You're delusional. I haven't been happy in years, Jack, and honestly, I don't think you've been either." Her words cut deep, but I pushed past the pain. "You think that justifies what you've done? Do you even care about the damage you're causing?" She rolled her eyes, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "This isn't about you. It's about me finally taking control of my life." "And what about the boys?" I asked, my voice breaking. "What happens to them?" Her expression softened for a moment, but then she smirked. "They'll be fine. Kids are resilient. Besides, they'll stay with me. You know how this works." Her words hit me like a blow to the chest. I knew she was right. The laws in our state heavily favored mothers in custody disputes. Susie had spent more time with the boys, and her image as a loving mother was carefully crafted. If we went to court, the odds were stacked against me. "You think you can just take everything?" I asked, my voice shaking with anger. "The house and property are also in my name." She laughed softly, shaking her head. "I don't think, Jack. I know, the law is on my side. Unless you want a long, ugly divorce that'll leave you broke, you'll do what I say." Her arrogance was maddening, but it also gave me clarity. This wasn't just about her infidelity anymore, it was a power play, and she thought she held all the cards. "You're forgetting one thing," I said, leaning forward. "The boys aren't just yours, they're ours, and I'll fight for them with everything I have." Her smirk faded slightly, but she quickly regained her composure. "And what judge is going to side with you? A workaholic who barely spends time with his kids? Meanwhile, I've been their primary caregiver, their stability." Her words stung because they were partially true. I worked long hours, and Susie had always been more involved in their day-to-day lives, but I wasn't going to let her narrative go unchallenged. "You might think you've got this all figured out," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me, "but you've made mistakes, and I have proof." Her confidence faltered for the first time. "What proof?" she asked, her voice laced with uncertainty. I leaned back, letting the moment hang in the air. "Photos, messages, GPS logs. You've been careful, Susie, but not careful enough." For a moment, she looked genuinely rattled, but then she scoffed, crossing her arms. "Even if you have proof, it doesn't matter. Judges don't care about affairs, Jack. They care about what's best for the kids, and that's me." Her confidence was infuriating, but it also highlighted the uphill battle I faced. She wasn't wrong, courts rarely consider infidelity in custody decisions, but I couldn't let that stop me. I needed to find a new angle, something that would tip the scales in my favor. The conversation ended with neither of us backing down. Susie retreated upstairs, slamming the bedroom door behind her, while I stayed in the living room, staring at the empty glass in my hand. Her words echoed in my mind. a constant reminder of the challenges ahead. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. Susie thought she had me cornered, but she underestimated me. If the law wasn't on my side, I would find another way. I couldn't let her damage our family and walk away unscathed. The next morning, I started making calls. First, to my lawyer, updating him on the situation and asking for advice. He reiterated the challenges I faced but encouraged me to focus on building a case that highlighted my role as a father. You need to show the court that you're indispensable to your kids' lives, he said. Document everything: school pickups, doctor's appointments, bedtime routines. The more involved you are, the stronger your case will be. His advice was practical, but it wasn't enough. I needed more than just documentation. I needed a strategy that would expose Susie's true nature without damaging the boys in the process. As the days passed, I began implementing small changes. I spent more time with the boys, taking them to the park, helping with their homework, and being present in ways I hadn't been before. It wasn't just about building a case, it was about reminding myself of what I was fighting for. But I knew I couldn't rely on my actions alone. Susie's arrogance was her greatest weakness, and I planned to use it against her. If she wanted to play dirty, I was ready to meet her on her level. This wasn't just about winning, it was about protecting my family, my dignity, and my future.